went to his merchant just to get some meat and meal. Farmer went to his merchant just to get some meat and meal.
Our goal for part two is to look at what changed about the Southern economy during Reconstruction. Where we left it last time, the radical Republicans, Congress has taken over Reconstruction, and they're looking at rebuilding the entire society of the South, not just a forgive and forget, let's move on, we'll get rid of slavery and then just, that's it. They're looking at a radical restructuring of the South. Now we'll focus more on the politics and the social aspects of that, but we do need to understand there are some attempts made to reinvent the Southern economy. Now part of that is also going to be something that has to be done because of, thankfully, finally, slavery is gone. And so one of the things that we want to do first is step back and just refresh our memories a little bit about what the Southern economy was prior to the Civil War. And remember, the phrase was King Cotton. Cotton was king. That was the number one industry in the South, cotton plantations, and that was primarily what slave labor was used for, to keep those cotton plantations going. Otherwise, throughout the South, you had a large number of subsistence farmers, people that are farming to, produce enough food to stay alive. That's the definition, roughly, of a subsistence farmer. They're not necessarily trying to make money. They're just raising enough food to keep themselves going, and if they have a little extra here and there to be able to sell and make some money, they're going to do that. But subsistence farming is more at that level of just producing your own food. Otherwise, economically in the South, there were not that many large cities, and industry was almost non-existent in the South, which is one of the reasons why they lost the war. It's one of the reasons why it's kind of amazing that the South was able to fight as long as they were, because they were so outgunned industrially, literally outgunned. Their ability to produce weapons is dwarfed by the North. It's one of those things where if you added up all the industrialization and the industrial output of all the southern states, it's only a small fraction of what the state of New York was able to produce, and so it leaves out all the other northern states. And so that's something that is going to change here. There's going to be an opportunity that some forward-looking Southerners realize to really change the South, to really reinvent the way they do business. And it's interesting that in a weird kind of way, Atlanta has been done a favor by William Tecumseh Sherman by its destruction, because it really gave Atlanta a blank slate to rebuild in a much more modern way. It's not an accident, or it's not an coincidence that Atlanta today is one of the dominant southern cities, and for instance, its airport is the busiest airport in the country. It's a hub. Atlanta is exploding as a city today. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to be something that's going to take decades, century. Economically speaking, industrially speaking, the South is going to lag behind for 100 years. And that's not going to fix overnight. That's not going to change overnight. As we look at Reconstruction here, I don't want you to get the idea that, the South is suddenly just going to be on par with the North economically with its industry. It is going to be lagging behind well into the 1900s. We'll look at, in other units of study, efforts that are made to try and stimulate the Southern economy and help develop Southern industry, as they are slow to break away from their King Cotton and the slave-owning past. Earlier I talked about how the Southern economy was like they were holding on to something that existed thousands of years ago. with a slavery economy. So that's not something that they're going to close that gap and reinvent themselves overnight. What industry is brought to the South? One of the things that we need to note here is that the industry that is brought to the South after the Civil War is primarily um, in the early stages, the less profitable stages of industrialization. A good example of that is like the lumber industry. The lumber industry does blossom in the South. And so there are a lot of people that make money selling boards in the lumber industry in the South, or taking wood products and making paper, for instance. But there is more money to be made not in those first initial stages of industrialization. There's more money to be made when you take those raw materials like that lumber and you process it into something that is of much higher value, like furniture. And so there isn't much in the way of that kind of high dollar industry in the South, even as they begin to industrialize. It's still going to be the less profitable version of industrialization. You're really looking at, in the last several decades, my lifetime, that the South has really blossomed on an industrial level.
Led old Billy up to the rack, beat him across the head till the captain got back. I'm sticking it by the pound. Boys, the wagon's coming down.
One of the more immediate concerns that we need to talk about here is, what about the newly freed slaves? They have been given their freedom, which is, a considerable gain, but that's all they've been given. That's all they have is their freedom now. If you were a slave, you own no possessions, you own no property, you have the clothes on your back, and that's it. So how are you going to make a living? What job skills do you have? Where do you get started? And the job skill that you have is whatever you did as a slave, which meant that the vast majority of them know how to raise cotton. And so that is going to be the immediate solution for a huge number of the former slaves. Now, some of them are just going to hit the road regardless. I'm getting out of here. And many of them are going to go and try and find family members. But for those that stay, their first place they're probably going to visit is the plantation house of the person that was their owner when they were a piece of property under the slave laws just prior to this. So what was worked out between the former slaves and the former plantation owners, or they still own the plantation, the former slave owners, was a system called sharecropping. And it's right there in the name, how sharecropping works. Sharecropping is a system in which a sharecropper is going to get everything they need to put a crop into the ground from the landowner. They're going to get the land, they're going to get the seed, they're going to get the tools. In the meantime, they're going to probably provide them with some kind of place to live and anything else that they might need to put a crop in the ground. At the end of the year, they're going to have to pay back for everything that they have borrowed to put the crop in the ground. And then the term sharecropping comes from the idea that the owner of the land gets a share of the crop, and the person who raised the crop gets a share of the crop. They're doing this on shares. And so what happens many times is that the sharecroppers, when they were done for the year, when you did the final analysis of the money that you made selling your portion of the cotton crop, because this is only good if you sell it, it doesn't, you're not going to be eating cotton. So when you sold that portion of the crop that came to you under the sharecropping system, and you paid off all of the rents and the debts for everything that you had to put the crop in the ground, anything that you had left over was your profit. And what a lot of people found, a lot of sharecroppers found, is once they were done paying off everything that they owed for the year, that they actually were in more debt than when they started. They could not pay off all of the debts from their share of the crop. And thus, they were pretty much required to come back and do the same thing again next year. It wasn't legal to walk away from those debts. It's still not legal to just walk away from a debt. And so the only solution that they had was to come back and be a sharecropper again the next year and hope that next year maybe the crop was better, or whatever might be the case, where you would have enough money to actually be money ahead, to have actually worked and made money instead of working all year at a very labor-intensive job. Sharecropping and picking cotton, raising cotton is not an easy job, only to have lost money throughout the entire year. Now, this is not slavery, but it's not quite freedom either when you're in that situation, because, again, you don't just have the ability to say, I'm done with this, if you're legally on the hook to pay that off and to try and do something. Because what were the other alternatives? You had no education as a freed slave. In most southern states, it was illegal to actually educate the slaves. Remember, that goes back to some of the slave rebellions where they got harsher and tried to crack down on slave rebellions by making slave life even harsher. So it wasn't like there was something else that you could do. Now I'm finally not a slave. I can be the lawyer that I've always wanted to be. That was, where do you get started? You don't have the money to open your own business, and you don't have the skills to open your own business. So the vast majority of the former slaves are stuck doing what they did while they were slaves, and they end up in this cycle of sharecropping. We talk about the cycle of debt that you would get into. And if you look in your notes there, you can see a little closer in that graphic organizer how it goes around there. And there you can see on a map just how prevalent this system was. This sharecropping was not something that happened just in a few remote corners of the South. It was the primary way that the former slave owners replaced their labor force. And many of them figured out that they could actually be more profitable as sharecroppers than they were as plantation owners and slave owners. Now, there was a little bit of growth potential here. One step up from sharecropping was tenant farming. And under tenant farming, you pay a cash rent up front in the year. And now the bonus of being a tenant farmer is that if you pay that cash rent up front, then everything that you produce that year is going to be yours to keep. You don't have to share the crop at the end of the year. So why would any landowner be willing to take the risk of taking on a tenant farmer versus a sharecropper? And the short answer is, under tenant farming, if you're the landowner, it's guaranteed money. If you give me my rent for the year, I don't care from that point forward what happens to your crop. That's completely a you problem. So that's really attractive as the landowner. There's no risk involved here. I've got cash and I'm done. The risk is taken on by the sharecropper, the tenant farmer now, but they also have the upside of potentially making a larger profit when they get to keep the whole crop. Now, most people that were sharecroppers probably fluctuated between sharecropping and tenant farming on a year-to-year basis, depending on maybe what you did the year before. If you have a couple of good years as a sharecropper, maybe you have enough money to actually pay for the rent up front and become a tenant farmer. But if you have a rough year as a tenant farmer, you might have to drop back down to sharecropping. It wasn't unheard of to have a few good years of tenant farming and to actually purchase some property. That was not unheard of, but it was not the norm either. It's not going to describe a majority of the freed slaves and what they did for a living. Most of them are going to be stuck in between sharecropping and tenant farming. Okay. And so one of the biggest things that has changed, again, and you have to look at this if you're very cynical about it. In a lot of cases, it looks like, well, you can't really walk away from this. How is this different than being a slave? And don't get me wrong, it is different. But if you really want to be really cynical about how you look at it, the only thing that's really changed is where you live on the plantation. If you look at that map, during the days of slavery, you'll notice that the slave quarters were all close to the big house. And that's because the slave owners wanted to be able to keep an eye on the slaves and make sure they didn't run away. Afterwards, the sharecropping cabins are more spread out and on the plots of lands that the sharecroppers are going to work. And there's a picture of a sharecropper cabin. The cabin is almost more flattering than what it deserves. The other thing that I always like to point out when I get to that photograph is look at the racial makeup of the family there. That's a white family. And so sharecropping was not strictly just the domain of freed slaves. There were many, many poor whites that were also in that sharecropping and tenant farming system. So if you really want to look at it, and you really think about this, again, slavery is gone, but it doesn't seem like this is quite the freedom that we think of as freedom today.
Boy, the wagon's coming down to haul the cotton home. Come, cotton, come, I'm picking it by the pound.